2,000 feet of granite. That is what Iran built its most protected nuclear bed around. Not a bunker, not a hardened basement under a military base, a mountain hollowed out in the middle of the Iranian plateau where the most advanced centrifuges the Islamic Republic ever built could spin in the dark while the rest of the world calculated and speculated and, for the better part of 2 decades, did nothing. Then, on a single night in late June, America came for that mountain. What followed was the most ambitious counter-bunker operation in the history of modern air power. 12 aircraft, thousands of miles of aerial refueling, the first operational use of the largest conventional penetrating bomb on Earth, and, in the months since, the slow and unsettling realization that the crater at Fordow is, in many ways, a closed chapter. What is being built around that crater is the next chapter, and most of the conversation is still trapped inside the last one. That is what I want to fix in this breakdown. I want to walk you through what actually happened at Fordow, what the strike really accomplished versus what was claimed, why the rebuilding now visible to commercial satellites changes the entire strategic equation, and what the sequence signals about where Iran's nuclear program is going next. Because the Fordow story did not end when the bombs fell. It became more complicated, and the more complicated version is the one that matters. If you care about this kind of slow, deliberate strategic analysis, consider subscribing. We do not chase outrage here. We chase clarity, and what is happening beneath Iran's mountains right now is exactly the kind of story that rewards patience over panic. Let's start with the target, because the target is the entire story. Fordow is not just another facility on a list of nuclear sites. It is the symbolic centerpiece of Iran's deep burial doctrine, the bet that has defined the program for 2 decades. The site sits near the city of Qom, embedded inside a mountain ridge, and the engineering genius of it, from Tehran's perspective, was never simply enrichment capacity. The genius was the depth. Iran built it deep. The real number, the one reflected in actual engineering literature and strike planning documents, is roughly 80 to 90 meters of granite and metamorphic rock above the operational halls. That is 260 to 295 feet, the rough equivalent of a 10-story building laid on its side and packed into a mountainside. The 2,000 feet you may have heard quoted is a number, not a measurement. Headlines and marketing copy inflate depth because inflated depth sells better than measured depth. Measured depth is the number the bomb was built to defeat. Inflated depth is the number that makes a story sound impossible. Iran wanted impossible. America arrived with possible. Read that distinction carefully, because everything else flows from it. The American weapon and the Iranian mountain were by design a match. Iran built as deep as it believed it needed to build. America spent years and extraordinary sums building the largest conventional penetrating bomb in its arsenal to defeat exactly that depth. This was not coincidence. This was counter-doctrine, developed in advance, deployed on a single night. And that distinction, more than any other, is where most coverage of this strike misses the point. This was not a punitive strike aimed at sending a message. The weapon, the routing, the timing, the choice of target, all of it was engineered around one very specific problem. How do you reach something that was designed deliberately and painstakingly to be unreachable? So what actually happened on the night of June 21, 2025? A strike package of roughly 12 American aircraft, including B-2 Spirit stealth bombers operating out of the continental United States, transited thousands of miles supported by an aerial refueling bridge that crossed multiple time zones and several international airspaces. The aircraft carried, for the first time in operational combat history, the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. 13.5 tons of precision-guided steel and explosive, designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to reach deep into hardened underground infrastructure and collapse its operational envelope. The targets were not chosen at random. Fordow's ventilation and access shafts were the primary aim. Natanz received additional strikes, along with adjacent nuclear-related infrastructure. The plan was to attack not just the halls themselves, but the breathing apparatus that kept the halls functioning. A centrifuge hall can survive a near miss. It cannot survive the loss of power, the loss of cooling, the loss of airflow. The plan targeted the support system, not just the chambers. The mission, codenamed Operation Midnight Hammer, was briefed publicly within hours of execution. The Pentagon's assessment was direct. Fordow had suffered severe damage. The most protected enrichment halls were no longer operational in any meaningful sense. The cratered shafts and choked tunnel mouths were visible to commercial satellites within a day, and the imagery circulated widely. President Trump declared the mission a tremendous success. On screen, on paper, in the official narrative, the strike looked devastating. This is where I have to slow down, because the picture is far more complicated than the official version suggests, and the complication is the entire point. The GBU-57 is a precision instrument. It is engineered to crater ventilation. It is engineered to collapse access. It is engineered to deny airflow and disrupt the support systems that keep a deeply buried facility running. It is not engineered to vaporize a mountain. It is not designed to confirm with verifiable certainty that every cascade, every centrifuge, every piece of critical hardware inside the mountain is destroyed beyond recovery, because no one is going inside. Iran has not invited the IAEA back into Fordow. Independent verification of cascade status, of centrifuge damage, of structural integrity, of any remaining weapons-grade material on site, all of this is inferred rather than confirmed. It is read from satellite craters and from Iranian behavior, not from on-the-ground inspections. So the question of what the strikes actually accomplished becomes a question of what we can see, not a question of what we know. Most serious assessments, including those from independent nuclear analysts outside any government, converge on a middle answer. The strike was real, the damage was real, the most protected enrichment halls at Fordow were likely set back by months, possibly years. Iran's fastest path to a working weapon got slower, but Iran's nuclear knowledge was untouched. This is the part that does not get enough emphasis in the public debate. Knowledge does not live in centrifuges. Knowledge lives in scientists, in designs, in archived assay results, in the institutional memory of a program that has been running for 2 decades. You cannot crater that. Knowledge is the part of the program that survives any strike that does not end the regime itself. And here is the second problem, the one that is now defining the entire next phase of the contest. Commercial satellite imagery, the kind any analyst with the right subscription can pull and analyze, has begun to show activity again at and around Fordow. Excavation, equipment movement, what appears to be reconstruction work near the cratered shafts. Iran is approaching the crater. Iran is reopening the mountain. That single fact, more than any other, is the pivot point of this story. Not whether the strikes worked. The strikes worked. The pivot is what happens when a strike degrades a target, and the target's owner decides to rebuild, and the rest of the world has to decide whether to strike again, on a faster tempo, in a more contested political environment, against a target that may or may not be the same target twice. This is the pattern that most Western commentary has missed, and it is the one you should be tracking. Iran is not rebuilding in place to be hit in place. Iran's strategic question after Fordow was simple. If the deepest mountain in the program is no longer safe, where do we go next? The answer appears to be dispersal and depth shifting, exactly the pattern that experienced arms control analysts warned about for years. Reports and satellite observation have shifted attention to a site known in Western reporting as Pickaxe Mountain, a suspected deep burial facility near Natanz that could become the next generation of Fordow. Iran is investing in multiple smaller, less photogenic sites, in faster centrifuge configurations, and in knowledge redundancy across facilities that no single satellite pass can fully count. The program is becoming less like a target you can point at, and more like a pattern you can only map with effort. You can crater one node, you cannot crater a network. The United States knows this. Reports in early to mid-July of 2026 indicated that Washington had notified Congress under the War Powers Resolution that additional operations were either underway or actively contemplated. The targets in question were not Fordow. Fordow is, for the moment, a closed chapter. The new candidate targets are the rebuild sites and the harder candidates. Pickaxe Mountain was named in coverage as a possibility. Other hardened locations, including elements of the Parchin military complex and the less-known Taligan II facility, also drew attention. Iranian-backed proxy activity in the Gulf spiked in the same window, sending a clear signal that any new strike would carry a price. And now we are watching a sequence. Each round in the sequence consumes something on both sides. Let's slow down and talk about that, because the consumption is the part most coverage quietly excludes. There is a finite number of times any administration can crater a mountain inside Iranian territory before the international coalition that tolerates the strikes begins to fatigue. There is a finite number of war powers notifications a sitting president can issue before domestic politics begin to count. There is a finite shelf life on public tolerance for entering another Middle Eastern air campaign, even one carefully framed as defensive and surgical, and every strike generates fresh material for Iran's nuclear justification. Every crater becomes a recruitment poster. Israel, which has argued for years that Iran's program cannot be allowed to reach a survivable weapons threshold, is now asking a different and harder question. Can a series of strikes, each technically impressive and each carefully targeted, actually remove that threshold, or are they merely moving it? Each strike buys time. Each strike also buys Iran time to adapt, to disperse, and to harden what remains into something even harder to reach. Iran is also facing a finite count. Every act of rebuilding is a provocation. Every provocation risks retargeting. The regime is being asked, in essence, to choose between symbolic defiance and strategic invisibility. It cannot have both. It cannot rebuild visibly in place and expect not to be hit again in place. That is the trade-off Tehran is making now, and it is a trade-off that will define the next 6 to 12 months. And then there is the verification problem that does not get enough airtime in the public debate. The IAEA, the eyes of the international community inside Iran's program, has been restricted in what it can access. Inspections are not happening at Fordow. They are not happening at the rebuilt sites. Outside observers, including the United States, are working from satellite interpretation, from human intelligence fragments, from economic and procurement indicators, and from signals intelligence. They are not working from direct inspection. That is a dangerous place to make decisions from. Confirming a violation when you cannot see inside is one difficulty. Confirming restraint when you cannot see inside is another. The asymmetry of visibility favors Iran, the asymmetry of attribution favors Iran, and the asymmetry of patience is the variable the West is now negotiating with, because every additional round of escalation costs the West politically in ways it does not cost Iran. It also shapes the energy market in ways that do not get enough emphasis. The Strait of Hormuz, roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest, transits a significant share of global seaborne crude. During periods of tension, tanker traffic becomes vulnerable to Iranian-backed actors and to Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps maritime units. Reports in 2026 of activity and incidents in the Gulf pushed insurance premiums up, pushed shipping reroutes, and priced disruption risk directly into crude benchmarks. Oil prices do not only reflect supply and demand, they reflect the probability of disruption. And that probability went up the moment Iran's nuclear doctrine was hit, and the moment the regime signaled it would not absorb the cost in silence. So when you hear analysts say that the June 2025 strikes changed the calculus, ask them which calculus. The strategic calculus moved, the political calculus shifted, the energy calculus changed, the verification calculus got harder. Each of these moved in a different direction. Now let me bring this back to where it started. 2,000 feet of granite, the Iranian bet. The bet was always the same. Depth itself is a weapon of deterrence, a weapon of patience, a weapon of time. Build deep enough, hide well enough, work quietly enough, and the depth becomes in practice indistinguishable from invulnerability. You survive the inspections, you survive the scrutiny, you survive the speculation, and one day perhaps you survive into the threshold. America answered that bet with the largest conventional penetrating weapon ever built. And on the night it was used, Iran learned what depth actually costs when an adversary decides to pay the bill. But the answer to the bet is not the crater. The crater is one move. The next move is whether Iran, having been cratered, can rebuild in places America cannot crater, or whether America, having cratered once, can crater again and again at a tempo and cost Iran cannot match. Or whether diplomacy, exhausted as it is, can find a path inside this contest that neither side can win militarily. The United States demonstrated on the night of June 21, 2025, that it can reach and damage the deepest facility in Iran's nuclear architecture. That capability was disputed and frightening for years. It is no longer disputed. It is on the record. Iran demonstrated in the months after that it can absorb a major strike, restrict inspectors, begin repairs under the cover of fog, and signal to its own population and to its allies that the program is not finished. That resilience was also disputed. It is no longer disputed. What remains disputed, and what will define the next chapter, is whether this exchange of demonstrations ends in a deal or in war, in verifiable restraint or in covert acceleration, in a slower slope or a steeper one. Whether the rebuilding now visible on satellite is a face-saving exercise or the first stage of a new dispersal strategy. Whether the next round of strikes, if there is one, buys enough time to matter, or whether time is the variable that no longer bends to anyone's favor. The honest assessment is this. The strikes gave Washington a window. America showed it can hold the threshold briefly against a determined opponent, but the window is not permanent. It is not even long. And every day that passes without inspection, without verification, without a diplomatic architecture underneath the military pressure, is a day in which Iran is using the depth it always intended to use, the depth of patience. That is the contest still being fought beneath Iran's mountains, not the depth of granite, the depth of time. What do you think? Was Operation Midnight Hammer a decisive blow that changed Iran's strategic calculus, or did it just teach Tehran exactly where to build next? Drop your read in the comments. I want to know whether you believe we are watching the end of Iran's nuclear program or just the beginning of its most dangerous chapter.